Hi, everyone, and welcome to Build. I'm your host, Cole Delbick. Thank you for joining us for this special evening to discuss 5B, an incredibly compelling film which documents the story of everyday heroes who took extraordinary action to comfort, protect, and care for the patients of the first HIV/AIDS ward unit at San Francisco General Hospital. 5B, a film presented by Riot, a Verizon media company, is told through the first-person testimony of the nurses and caregivers who built Ward 5B in 1983, their patients, loved ones, and staff who volunteered to create care practices based in humanity and holistic well-being during a time of great uncertainty. But before we bring out tonight's special guests, let's take a look at the trailer for 5B.
The 70s were about that attempt that we made to carve out a place for ourselves in society that had never been done before. It is a big deal.
1981 was when things really began to change.
We had patients that came through with this illness. Within a month or two, boom, he was gone.
Nearly 3,000 cases of AIDS have already hit this city.
Nobody even knew how it was spread.
They wanted to quarantine us on an island.
I had seen patients being marginalized, and I just found it infuriating.
We were expected to wear what we called spacesuits, and some would refuse to give care.
We have to do something.
At San Francisco General Hospital, the staff is gearing up for the opening of a special wing to treat AIDS victims.
The nurses there physically built that ward.
They made the rules as they went along.
I don't want nobody here to give up. And I don't think that they will.
I saw what a toll it was taking on us.
I was drinking more every night.
I remember having recurrent nightmares.
We were being attacked on all fronts, politically, medically.
There was a guy who had applied for insurance, and they couldn't ask him if he was gay. So they said, have you ever worked as a florist, a hairdresser, or a decorator?
There were still nurses operating from fear.
They went to the union. We don't want to take care of these people.
I might have some anxiety about this, but I'm more pissed off and angry than I am scared.
Why not bring life and laughter and joy?
This was a tangible thing you could do. It's just part of nursing.
They stood up when nobody else would, and they were willing to take those risks.
And they're all kind of kick-ass, even the straight ones.
I'm so honored to be joined today by two of the film's heroes, Alison Moed, one of the nurses in 5B, and Hank Plante, a Peabody Award-winning journalist. So let's please give it up for them and everyone who participated in this incredible film. You know, sort of to start us off, I'd love to hear a bit more about each of your journeys and how your lives intersected with this incredibly important and devastating moment in American history. Alison, maybe we can start with you. What first sort of compelled you to join the nursing profession, and why did you join the ward at that time?
That's those are pretty simple questions and easy ones, actually. I became 21, or my 21st birthday approached in 1967, and some of you may remember that. You may remember that or have heard of that as the Summer of Love. And so I traveled from New York to San Francisco because I was enthralled by this idea of love for your fellow human being. That's what I bought. It wasn't, it wasn't the sex, drugs, and alcohol. It was more the spirit of the thing. So I came out to California. I actually spent some time on a commune, and someone there spoke about nursing, and the idea stuck in my mind. And it took about a year. And then I was actually in London, kind of searching and trying to find what my path was going to be. But it was like a reverberation, like the ripples in the pool had finally reached their destination. And I thought, I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do it now. So I came back to the States. Of course, I had to wait a year, but I became a nurse, and I was so fortunate to have found that path. So I think that that same sense of caring brought me to the unit. And the way it happened was that I was a per diem nurse. I was working at San Francisco General. I was back in California again. I had been living in New York for quite a while. And I saw that there were patients who were not being treated well. They were being placed at the far ends of the unit, and they weren't being cared for by anyone, it seemed, except maybe just a few people. And then I heard, and so I was always assigned those patients. Clearly no one wanted to take care of them, so they gave them to the per diem nurse, who wasn't a member of the regular staff, and I was glad to take care of them. I found them very engaging. I didn't necessarily understand what was going on with them, because no one really explained that either, except they told me I had to wear a lot of paraphernalia, which I didn't necessarily do, because I didn't understand why. So then, as time went on, I became more aware, because I had lived with friends in the gay community. That's one of the reasons I moved out to San Francisco, was to stay with my friend while I went to school. And so I became aware that there was this gay cancer, that people were experiencing these strange phenomena of diseases, and that some of them were dying, that people were getting sicker. So when I heard it, when I heard about the unit, I was still working per diem, because I hadn't found my niche at that point. So I was working in hospice care, I was working in psychiatry, I was working with spinal cord injury patients, and then I heard about this unit. Someone said, hey, there's a sign up. Go look at the General about this unit that's going to take care of these patients with the gay cancer. And I came, so I was on it. I came to San Francisco General, I spoke to Cliff, and the more I talked with him in the interview, the more inspired I was, and I just hoped that he would hire me, and he did. So that was my journey.
I love that. Hank, what about you? What was your sort of first foray into journalism, and did you envision that LGBTQ activism would be sort of at the center of your work?
Oh, no. Alice and I are the same age. I won't say what that is, but we are spending all your Social Security money. But we have very different life paths. She's a very compassionate, loving, probably born to be a nurse. You can tell, I think, what a wonderful person she is. I'm a bulldozer, jackass reporter, and so we're a good match. But what happened, I also came out of the 60s, the generation that wanted to change the world, make it a better place. I was inspired by the Kennedy brothers, by Dr. King, and by the era. So I moved to Washington, D.C., thinking I would work in politics, which is what a lot of people, young people, did in those days. Not so much anymore. So I was applying for jobs on Capitol Hill. I was broke. I needed work. And I was walking down the street. I walked past the Washington Post. And you know how arrogant you are when you're 22 years old? You think you can do anything? So I just figured maybe I could work there. And so I walked into the newsroom back when you could. Now it's, you need a strip search to walk into a newsroom. And I walked in and I said, are there any jobs? And they liked me and they hired me as a copy boy. Jimmy Olsen in Superman is a copy boy. Sort the mail, answer the phones, you do errands and you help the reporters. And I did not plan I wanted to work in politics. This was temporary. I kept waiting for the calls to come from Capitol Hill, and I fell in love with the news business. I just fell in love with how interesting it all was and how they all seemed to know a little bit about so many different subjects because they had done stories on them. I didn't know the depth of their knowledge was about a 20-inch column. So then from there, so I became a newspaper reporter and then a television reporter, and then came out in my early 20s, and so I became one of the first openly gay TV reporters in the country. And so just to wrap this up, by the time I got to San Francisco, AIDS was beginning, and I am grateful because I had, by that time, learned my skills. I had come out, so I dealt with all that in my life, and I was ready to cover the heroic work that Allison and the other nurses were doing at the hospital.
You know, sort of the HIV/AIDS epidemic has been explored in film, especially documentary film before, like How to Survive a Plague comes to mind, but we've really never seen this story told before. And, you know, I was wondering, of course, this is a deeply painful and personal time in both of your lives. What was it like to sort of revisit? Were you reluctant at first, or were you sort of wanting to share this story now?
When someone approaches me in a manner that seems very sincere, I generally respond. And that's the way I was approached about the film. I was a little concerned because I didn't know how the jewels of our experience, and they really are, because I think any of us who lived through that time are very deeply affected. There's no sham. It's all there. So I didn't know how they really are jewels, would be received. But the more we talked to people, we became more hopeful and more trustful. The hope was that there would be, it wouldn't just be a story of this time, of that time, but also a story of the implications for the present time. And I think that was borne out in the film. So, but we didn't know. It was a little bit, I was very pleased at the prospect of a film that was speaking to the role of nurses and how nurses had stepped forward in a particular time, in this particular time, because I think the world of nurses generally, and so I was hoping the story would be told well, because it wasn't only a story of us, it was also going to be a story of those who we cared for.
What about you, Hank? How was it like to revisit that period?
So a very good question. You know, I had, like a lot of gay men my age, I have compartmentalized a lot of my feelings about that. You can't live with the pain of losing so many friends and have it in the forefront of your brain all the time. And so this really did unlock that. I found myself getting choked up when we were doing some of the filming, and I think that shows in the film. The second time I saw the film, I just cried my eyes out. I didn't cry the first time. But the first time we had a screening, and I was kind of studying it because I wanted to see what did they get wrong. And as it turns out, they didn't get anything wrong. They meaning Dan Kraus, the director. The second time, we went to the Cannes Film Festival. The film was selected for the Cannes Film Festival. I'm sitting next to Alison with all these wonderful nurses who I have fallen in love with. And sitting there in my new tuxedo, very formal. I mean, Elton John was behind us on the red carpet. I mean, this was a big deal. And I'm sitting in my tuxedo watching this film, and I think what happened was the first time I was studying the movie, the second time I was watching the movie. And I just cried my eyes out. And Alison had brought some Kleenex and kept feeding me Kleenex.
I was so moved, actually, because we didn't really know each other well, and but here we found ourselves sitting next to each other. We didn't have like a ongoing connection, and he was crying, and I was crying.
And now keep in mind, I'm a guy who confronted Richard Nixon on camera, so I don't cry. I don't cry. But thank you for doing that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was certainly bawling at my desk yesterday watching this. I understand completely. Something that jumped out to me as a viewer was how sort of the ward's mission at the time wasn't necessarily to cure these patients, but simply to care for them, and how radical the act of touching someone was. And I think someone in the film says, if I can't save these folks, the least I can do is touch them. So Alison, I'd love to know from you, how did sort of the practice of care challenge the norms of like clinical objectivity and the ways that you sort of infuse love and warmth and humanity into the environment, that was so sorely lacking in other spaces?
Objectivity and professionalism does not preclude emotion and warmth and human touch. In fact, hopefully one is an integral part of the other. I think nursing is a profession of caring, so we are taught to care. I was a nurse who gave back rubs. That's the kind of nurse I had always been. But this was a confluence of nurses, of people who wanted to care for this population that had been stigmatized, discriminated against, not cared for, during a period of their lives where they were invariably, their lives were ending. And so professionally, how do we care for them? You know, it's not to compartmentalize, to shut down for them would not be caring for them. And caring was what we were about. So we could reach out because we weren't afraid. We could be human with them. Was it extraordinarily painful, especially as time went on and the course of the disease became manifest and the numbers multiplied? It was incredibly painful, and it was incredibly difficult, but that just made us want to do better. And we had a group of patients who taught us how to care for them. So as professionals, we wanted to learn from our patients. We knew how to care for their symptoms. We knew how to bathe them and clean them up. We knew how to help them when they were having difficulty breathing. But they taught us how to accompany them when they were dying and how to help their loved ones make that journey as well. And they defined who their loved ones were, and they told us how they wanted to be treated, because often they knew far more about what was going on in research, et cetera, than we could be on top of. So it was kind of a perfect storm of carers and those who needed care, and there was like a meeting. You called it. Say what it was. You say it all the time, and I
remind me. I'm old.
It starts with the L. It starts with the L word.
Yeah. It is. I will tell you what it is. So this film is not a downer. I know we're talking about crying. This film it's about a disease that came out of nowhere. Nobody had seen it before. Didn't know where it came from. People were getting sick. They went to this brand new ward, only one in the world, AIDS ward, 5B, San Francisco General. The nurses intuitively knew how to take care of them. We didn't know how it was spread. Didn't know if it was airborne. Didn't know if you could get it from touching a surface. Didn't know if you could get it from hugging a patient. They didn't care. I mean, this is a love story.
That's what he calls it. And it's true. I think I love that you said that.
That's what this film is.
Yeah.
You know, what you built was so special. The ward is so special, and we actually have a clip to sort of show how the ward came to be. So let's take a look at that.
I see signs up about this new unit. I was instantly really interested. There's an enemy, and it's a disease.
I'd heard about this dedicated AIDS unit. I came from New York, and I had this hope that I could get a job on this unit. I had seen patients being marginalized, and I just found it infuriating. And then I got called for an interview. One of the staff said, "What is your zodiac sign?" And I just said, "Cancer." And she said, "Well, good, because there's too many Leos on nights."
It was built by the nurses there, and they physically built that ward.
We were making it. We were creating it.
The nurses all volunteered for this duty.
If I had said no to any of them, they might have done physical harm to me.
Cliff had a vision. We were gay, we were straight, we were young, we were old.
And they're all kind of kick-ass, even the straight ones.
You know, so of course people in the HIV/AIDS community still are the target of tremendous stigma today, but I think it's really important to understand how deep that discrimination was back then and how insurmountable some of those obstacles were. So how would each of you describe sort of the attitude toward the disease at the time among healthcare workers and also sort of the general population?
I'd say among healthcare workers, my experience was as I described. that nurses made homophobic remarks. I was appalled. People were afraid to take care of the patients, and they didn't. We have a background that's based on science. But people didn't listen to what they knew. They listened to what their fears were, and I think that what enabled their fears was the homophobia and the fear of people who were different than them. So they let that take over and be the controlling factor. Healthcare workers who came to the unit and wanted to gown and glove and everything, those who weren't afraid of our patients as people, who saw them as people, could hear and understand what we talked to them about when we said, you know what, really, this is not a disease that's spread by touching. It's not, you're not going to get it if someone coughs. People could hear that if they were letting their humanity understand that there were other people. These were just other people just like them that they were dealing with. If they chose to revert to the fears that they had of someone who is different, someone who is gay, pretty much gay, then they let it blow up. They let themselves become hateful. And we saw that, and there were several instances of that in the film that we could see.
Hank, what about you? How would you characterize the climate at the time?
Well, as far as the healthcare workers in the film, we can see that there were nurses who did. They described they didn't want to do what these good nurses were doing, and they didn't want to help out like that. And they even referred to what they said was a homosexual mafia that was, I'm paraphrasing, was kind of running things in the hospital. When I saw that the first time, I thought, homosexual mafia, I guess now it'll be very organized crime. Anyway, so that was inside, but then outside the hospital, it was horrible. I mean, first of all, the Reagan administration was doing nothing. Ronald Reagan didn't say the word until 6 years into the epidemic, and I was standing in front of him, as you mentioned, in D.C., the night that he said that word for the first time, 6 years into the epidemic, and I made a note in my reporter's notebook that at that moment, 21,000 Americans had already died from AIDS. San Francisco was a little better. We had Mayor Dianne Feinstein, who's in the Senate now, and whose AIDS budget for the city of San Francisco was bigger than President Reagan's budget was for the United States. That was true for 2 years in a row. We had a brand new young member of Congress named Nancy Pelosi, who had just come in '86, who hired a staffer, and his job was AIDS. I mean, get the money, get the research going, and there was a lot of discrimination. People were being kicked out of their apartments. There were no laws to protect them. People were being fired over it. There was a guy who worked at a company in San Francisco, progressive San Francisco, a guy who worked at a company who died of AIDS. They took his desk out to the parking lot and burned it. So it was pretty horrible. Yep.
Wow. You sort of mentioned the reaction to some of the nurses, and you see this in the film, and it created this really deep division in the medical community, especially at a time where we didn't know how the virus was transmitted. I think it raises this interesting sort of question of morality, because there was some risk at the time. What are sort of we willing to sacrifice to provide care to other people? Was that a question that you wrestled with at the time? And so what was your reaction to your fellow nurses who maybe weren't as open or accepting or understanding of what these people were going through?
You know, I try to talk with people. That's my way. I try to educate them. I try to interact with them on a human level. But if they can't hear me, if they couldn't hear me, then don't step foot on my unit. There was no need to. Once I became nurse manager, I hired the nurses who worked on our unit. If someone who worked elsewhere in the hospital came onto the unit, wanted to gown and glove, wanted to preach or condemn, didn't want to provide the service that they were supposed to be providing and couldn't hear what we were saying, what I was saying, then they didn't belong there. They, there's call their supervisor, send someone else. So my job as a nurse manager was to try to create a bubble on our unit, because we were there to provide care. We were there to do a job. So if you're not with us, then just go on your own way. You don't need to be here. You don't need to work with us, or as Cliff would have said, you don't need to be in the hospital, and you don't need to be in the profession of nursing, because we do have a duty to care.
And Cole, there was backlash in the TV stations. I mean, there were people in my own station who did not like the fact that we were covering AIDS so much, that it would cost us ratings. You don't want to put gays on TV every night, as I was doing. Fortunately, I had managers who let me do what I wanted, and who saw it as a compelling story and a public service, and we had to keep covering it. But there was an incident at another TV station in San Francisco, not mine, where a photographer refused to go into the room of an AIDS patient who was being interviewed. He shot the interview from the doorway, and the reporter went in and had to hold a stick mic like this rather than a clip-on lavalier mic. Hold a stick mic, the photographer shot it from the doorway. It's the only way the story got done.
But that wouldn't have been on our unit. We wouldn't have let them on our unit. That was something that we could do. Sorry, go on.
Oh, they used me. These nurses used me. You were talking about touching, nurses holding and touching patients. I only learned this when we were making the documentary. The director said to me, do you know that they told me when I was interviewing these nurses that before you would come over there with your TV camera, they would meet and they would say, no, be sure to hold the patient on camera. There's a lot of touching. We want to send that visual message that it's okay. And so I said in the film, nurses are subversive. They really are.
In that sense, we were, and as Cliff said, we were kick-ass. Yeah. Because if all these, as our fame grew because of what we were doing, what we were daring to do, and we didn't see ourselves as daring, but driven to provide good care. If these reporters, if people from all over the world were going to come to see us, well then, gosh darn it, they were going to see what we were really doing, and we were going to make sure they saw it. Yeah. So that's what we did. We just did what we did, but we did it so they could see it. And our wonderful patients were complicit in a way, because they were so courageous to allow and to welcome people, not only other healthcare providers, but also the media onto the unit. So that was, when they did that, that was almost like a sacred trust in a way, because they were trusting us to take care of them, to show what was really right, the right way to care for them. So we were going to do that as best as we could, knowing that the media can take the story and run with it. So we were going to give them our story.
Hank, one of my favorite moments of you in the film is how you talk about you enjoy sort of confronting the bad guys. You like getting in their face, which to me is so tremendously brave. What about that did you find to be effective, and did you sort of face certain pressures around that?
It helps me blow off steam. I mean, I had a lot of anger over this disease and a lot of grief over this disease, and it helped me to blow off steam. I loved chasing lawyers down the hallway who were going after AIDS patients. I loved confronting landlords who were evicting them from their apartments. What was the rest of your question, Cole? I'm sorry.
Yes, it sort of fueled you in a way.
Oh, sure, absolutely. It was a motivator. Plus, I didn't feel quite so powerless. I mean, we all felt powerless, those of us on the outside. I mean, there were no drugs. There was no medication. Our friends were dying. You would see someone, and he looked healthy, or she, and see them a few weeks later, and they looked emaciated, and then be gone. It was a very powerless feeling, and so I felt at least that I was trying to do something instead of just standing by and watching it all happen.
You mentioned earlier about sort of the White House and the Reagan administration's complete inaction, and we actually have a clip that you were in the room when Reagan first said the word AIDS. So let's take a look at that.
Time we knew exactly what we were facing. And that's why I support some routine testing. I've asked the Department of Health and Human Services to determine as soon as possible the extent to which the AIDS virus has penetrated our society and to predict its future dimensions.
I stood in front of Ronald Reagan in 1987 in Washington when he was giving a speech. It was the first time he mentioned AIDS publicly, 1987. All right, 6 years into the epidemic. I made a note in my reporter's notebook that night, the night of that speech, as I'm looking at him, that I made a note that at that moment that he said that word for the first time, AIDS, 21,000 Americans had already died. That's what I remember.
What was it like to be in that room that day?
It was infuriating. That was an outdoor speech at night in D.C. Elizabeth Taylor dragged him to that. He didn't want to give it because he had not said the word, and she made him go. She's sitting next to him. You can't see it in the way that's shot. And it was infuriating. There was also, I don't know if you know this, you remember Mathilde Krim, who ran AMFAR, wonderful woman, an AIDS organization, very effective AIDS organization. There was a signal among the doctors in the audience that if they didn't like what he was saying, they were going to get up and walk out, and they were going to take the cue from Dr. Krim. As it turns out, and she tipped me off ahead of time so that we could widen out and roll on it if it happened. As it turns out, they did not walk out, but he said a lot worse than that. And it had come up in the White House press conferences already. And the first time that his press secretary, whose name escapes me, was asked about AIDS, some of the reporters laughed. This homosexual disease, talking about it in the White House press room, of all things. So, I mean, that was the tone.
You know, a major part of this film concerns itself with the case of Jane Doe, a woman on the ward, a nurse on the ward, who contracted the virus on the job. And it's sort of a really heartbreaking moment. You reveal that you were one of the ones to tell her that she had tested positively.
I was the one.
You were the one.
Yeah.
How did that sort of shape the dialogue surrounding medical care at the time?
What it really brought to the forefront was that finding and utilizing safer medical devices was imperative. That the odds against that we needed to change the odds against getting a needle stick. That was the message, and that was something that Jane Doe fought for years, and that's and nowadays those devices are in place. We had to take needle boxes. We had needle boxes where you would discard the needle. They were in the patient's bathrooms, so the nurses had to walk all the way into the bathroom. The first thing we could do is bring those devices to the point of care by the bedside so that the nurses could simply, could lessen the amount of time and the opportunity for getting stuck, for dropping a needle, for someone else to get stuck with. But the needle safety devices were of paramount importance, and that's what came to the fore.
And sort of the media had a bit of a field day with this case, sort of co-opting the narrative that she's this perfect victim of sorts and an example of why these patients, you shouldn't come into contact with these patients. What was that like sort of from in the media landscape, how that was treated?
There was it was treated exactly the way you just described, but there were several cases like that, not with needle sticks, but cases of bad reporting. I remember watching an ABC network news report one night, and their medical reporter, this was his job, he covered medicine, was doing a story on a doctor who had become HIV positive, and there was a line in his story, and he said, nobody knew if the doctor was spreading it all over the hospital. Now, what kind of a message does that send to people? He should have known better than that, and that was ABC. So there was really a lot of horrendous reporting.
And and we see in the film a lot of nurses and medical workers are sort of straight up refusing to care for these patients. And at a certain sort of a big turning point in the HIV/AIDS medical sort of care history, the labor union really shut down those complaints and sort of recentered the conversation about a nurse's duty, a medical worker's duty to care at the end of the day, really shifting sort of the dialogue forward. Were you expecting that outcome, or had you sort of resigned yourself a bit to, the situation that you were in?
I don't. I honestly, I don't recall. I think, in a way, it was going on in the background, but because we were generally really involved in our work, but it would have had terrible implications for us and for our patients if it had come to pass. It was something that would have changed the face of healthcare, to say, that a nurse could just make up their minds on the basis of their own feeling how to take care of a patient was plainly wrong, and to have legitimized that would have been a terrible thing. I mean, we have concerns about that today, that there's legislation that's speaking about nurses, healthcare workers deciding who they can care for or not care for. So it's a similar question, it's a similar problem that is very important.
Well, we actually have a clip of sort of the labor union's response, so let's take a look.
We were vindicated. We all took oaths. Nurses cannot legally, ethically refuse to care for anyone. If it's within our capability to do so, then we have to do it.
There is risk in this work. It's just part of nursing.
You are always going to work with bodily fluids. So if that is a problem, then there may be other, then accounting may be a better option.
We began to feel like the tide had turned.
British Health Minister Norman Fowler has come to San Francisco to study our AIDS care and research.
People came to our unit from worldwide to find out what we were doing, how or why we weren't afraid.
I didn't realize how little I knew. We had our own ideological biases that were unconnected with the facts surrounding the epidemic.
It's brought change for how hospitals work.
You don't have to have a hazmat suit every time you're around an AIDS person. You don't have to burn their bed because they died.
I'd like to introduce you to some of my staff.
They were having a heyday with all the attention they were getting. Except when the cameras were rolling, they were no different than all the rest of the nurses at San Francisco General. Civil service breeds laziness.
Some of those interviews with her were so infuriating. But that response was clearly such a turning point in this moment, and 5B became this example for hospitals around the world, and sort of this light, this beacon of hope. So before we go to audience Q&A, I'd love to hear, what do you think is sort of the legacy of 5B, and how do we experience that today?
I think the legacy is to remember your humanity, remember who you are, remember really that you're not so different from anyone else. And if there's someone who is different, who you perceive as different than you, who you're afraid of, that's a wonderful opportunity to find out all about them so that you can conquer your fear. And that we can reach out, each of us, in our own way to help one another. We were nurses, and we did what nurses did, but we were people doing what nurses, nursing people doing what nurses did, doing what people do. And so I think the implication is that we can all do this. We can all reach across the boundaries in troubled times and make a difference. I think in a world like today where the polarization seems to be increasing, the challenge is understanding, not increased polarization. And I think so the lesson is to remember who we are, and that really it is a labor of love, and that we can do unto others as we would have them do unto us. That's what we all learn when we're little. So why should we forget it now that we're a little older? Sounds very prosaic, but I think to me that's it. And I know he's going to talk about a different aspect of it. I think you're going to talk about HIV infection, as I've heard you, because that's the other piece of it.
You have to remind me. I forget.
I'm sorry. I don't want to. Just that's not a fight that's over. I mean, here I tend to be emotional and talk about the very basic stuff that I just mentioned. But in fact, also there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, we're in really the best shape ever on HIV in this country, if you have access to medication. It's a very serious problem in communities of color and in the rest of the world, and we can't lose sight of that. The news media has, which is why this film is important. People don't talk about AIDS. The media doesn't talk about AIDS. AIDS has gone into remission in newsrooms. And so this film is very important to keep the conversation alive. Cole, there's two audiences for this film, I think. There's people your age who I think AIDS has always kind of been part of their life. They grew up hearing about it. And there's people my age who lived through it and have put it out of their heads. We both need to see this film and keep talking about it.
Absolutely. And keep talking about good health care for all, because that's the basic issue. It's not only HIV. This film, HIV is really important, but so is the health of our public and our country and our world. So we can all play a role.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to some audience Q&As. I believe you have one question here. Hi.
This has been amazing. Thank you to Alison, Hank, Guy, and Steve, and everyone who's been a part of this film. My question is really an extension of what you just said. What is the most important piece for you, for viewers that go see this movie, to get out of it?
Well, I think both those pieces, that HIV is an infinitely, we have it in our power to really change the face, to remove it. Education, prevention, treatment, we can do that. So it's time to motivate, it's time to fund, it's time to reach out, it's time to provide in our own country a healthcare system that's accepting to all, no matter what your color is, what your religion is, who you go to bed with, how you identify sexually, what country you came from. We should all feel safe in our healthcare system, because I think we're only as healthy as the sickest one among us, really, as a society, frankly.
And I also think one of the lessons, thank you for that question, is that what we learned during the AIDS epidemic is you have to be your own healthcare advocate. And because the government might not necessarily help you, doctors might not have the latest information. You've got to really do the work yourself. It's very, very difficult, especially if you're ill and going through it. The last thing you want to do is to try to learn and study and get on the phone and argue with insurance companies. But that really is the lesson. That's why we saw groups like ACT UP change the course. I mean, they got the drugs moving, they got the money coming. They really did. And other healthcare groups have learned from that. You see breast cancer awareness, that group learned a lot from ACT UP, very effective group. So yeah, we got to help each other. We got to do this for ourselves.
We have another question.
Hank, Allison, I want to say thank you for your work. It takes a lot of courage to do what you've done. I want to know, who was your biggest level, or what was your biggest level of opposition during this time to trying to make this level of change that you did make?
When in our practice, what was the biggest? I think it was prejudice and ignorance, people buying into that and trying to use that against us. People, you'll see in the film that one of the doctors says, why should they have all that? You know, who are they? Well, they were people, and a lot of what we had on the unit didn't necessarily come from funding, but maybe it came from the community that reached out and made their presence known on the unit. Like Rita Rocket was an example of that. There was the gay community, even churches. You know, some of the churches wanted to come onto the unit and preach, but some wanted to come and sing Christmas carols and, you know, bring food and blessings. And we had the Godfather Fund. We ended up making our own volunteer fund. It's all, you asked me about the greatest opposition, and here I am talking about some of the most positive parts because, you know, I guess we're...
Because you're a nurse.
No, because both things happened. Where it was most difficult, we also seemed to receive the most. So maybe there's a lesson there. The more you give, the more you get. And that was true not only internally, but it came also from those around us. So.
You know, it's interesting you were saying there was some people felt, why should they have all of that? And there were a lot of stories about that. My friend Randy Schultz was a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. He wrote the book And the Band Played On, which really is the definitive book on how little the government was doing in the beginning. Randy died of AIDS. He wrote a story in the Chronicle that got a lot of play, and he went to, it might have been General, he went to a hospital and there were two patients next to each other. One was a guy who had cancer, the other was a guy who had AIDS. The guy who had cancer had no visitors and nothing except what the hospital was giving him. The guy who had AIDS, he had visitors, he had this AIDS organization paying his electric bill, he had another one cleaning his apartment, he had another one ready to deliver meals to his house when he got out, and the implication was, well, why should they have all that? Here's the thing, nobody was stopping straight people from taking care of their own. So, you know, my feeling is, let's not blame gay people for taking care of their own. I mean, we rose to the occasion, and I think, in fact, one of the reasons that we have seen such a tremendous change in acceptance of LGBTQ people began with AIDS. I think that the rest of the country, especially the straight world, looked at what my brothers and sisters were doing, and our esteem went up, rightfully so. I mean, I really think that it began there. I mean, we've never seen, and I usually cover politics, we have never seen a shift in polls like we have on same-sex marriage, for example. 60% against to over 60% today in a very short period of time. I think it all began during the AIDS epidemic.
We have one more question for you.
Hello.
Hi.
I also have a question for both you and Survivor Steve. So there's been so much change that's happened, and obviously the fight isn't over. So where do you see the future of the epidemic and like empathy in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, you know, I'm hoping that the people that have survived HIV are actually giving back to the community or to the world. You know, I personally have done it, and it makes me feel so good because even it's just a portion that I'm giving back for the care that I got from these wonderful nurses at San Francisco General. At Ward 5A, I feel like I have to give back, which I have tried to do as much as I possibly could. So I'm definitely giving back.
Thank you so much. Anything you guys want to add?
I just want to be sure to thank the people who made this film happen. Johnson & Johnson paid for it. They wanted to do something to acknowledge nurses. Obviously, they have a lot of connections with the nursing community. And Verizon Media is distributing it, and it wouldn't happen without them, so I'm really grateful for that.
And I will say one more thing to her. It's at, I'm sorry, I'm so me, because I always, but it's sort of like let your little light shine. She asked about the future of empathy. I think when I first came into Philadelphia, it was Pride Day there, and someone told me, oh, well, go walk down on 13th Street, and I did. And, you know, and people were out. There were young people out. The young people, they were everywhere, and they were proud. They were gay, they were proud, and they were out there, and they were just glowing. And I was glowing, and there were tears streaming down my face. This is what changes the world. You are what you are. You acknowledging yourselves, being proud of yourselves, makes you able to be compassionate and to reach out and to change the face of this epidemic and to change the face of the lives of all of us. You are the future, and I'm happy to see it. I love seeing all of you. Just be who you are. Don't think that nurses were heroes. It was nurses, as I said, doing what they do. It was patients being the men that they were. They were largely men then. And it was the lesbian and gay community banding together, as you said, as never before. It was like some kick-ass straight people, too. So let's do it. You know, we can do it now, too.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank both of you for sharing your stories and everyone involved in the film for just inspiring us all. So let's please give it up for everyone and check out 5B in theaters this weekend. Thank you so much.